Pain itself doesn't disqualify you from ministry. But unhealed pain, now that'll shape the way we do everything within the ministry, and especially how we lead. Sometimes that unhealed pain will look like control. Other times it'll look like isolation, or a lot of times that unhealed pain, it kind of surfaces through the way we use spiritual language and the actions behind it. Today isn't about shame, but it is about responsibility. Because if we don't let God heal what's beneath the surface, we'll eventually bleed out on all of those that we're supposed to lead closer to God. I'm Josh, and this is Beyond the Numbers. Hey everyone, welcome back to Beyond the Numbers. This is the podcast where we talk about real sustainable health within our ministries. Not so much about the hype or the brand or just the mere numbers, but what's actually going on within our churches, within our ministries that make us truly healthy. Now, we've already kicked off this second season with some big hits. We've talked about transition. We've talked about toxic manipulation and control. We've even talked about leaders as idols. But today I want to do a little bit of a flashback. We're going to go backwards just a little bit to a topic that we brought up last season in The Pain That Shaped Me, where I talked about my skin disorder and needing to be able to heal from it. And can I tell you, one of the biggest things that I've gotten from last season, lots of different feedback from some of you guys that watch on a consistent basis, some randomly that popped up that watch different things. But I found that more and more, there are so many of us leaders that struggle with pain. And so today I want to revisit that topic, not rehashing all this pain stuff, but more looking at what happens when we're called, but we're also wounded. And how do we lead when we haven't dealt with the pain that we're consistently going through? See, most ministry harm doesn't always come from bad theology, but a lot of it comes from unaddressed wounds that leaders have that continue to push through. And they make excuses about how they're just fine and everything's okay. But meanwhile, their wounds are replicating more wounds within those very ones that were meant to shepherd. So today I want to share a story from my life, not to glorify the pain, not to chase after sympathy, but to talk about what healing really looks like. And more importantly, what happens when the real healing is never addressed. But first, if conversations like this are helpful, subscribe and follow to make sure that you continue to get the best content from this season. All right, let's jump into this story. I spent a lot of my childhood in and out of hospitals, especially those infant years. I was born with a skin disorder called epidermolysa bullosa simplex. While there's a lot more medical terminology to all that is going on within my body, the basic thing was I had blisters. Blisters that were like second-degree burns that would appear all over my body, sometimes small dime-shaped ones, sometimes much, much larger. It was extremely painful, but on top of that, because it was a rare disorder, the doctors didn't really fully know what they were doing with it. So there were always tests, always different forms of medication, and different things to try to treat the underlying skin disorder. One of the big things that I was left with was constantly having these wounds that needed to be cared for. And because of that, as a young infant, infection was something that I battled with on an almost daily basis. I remember one hospital visit that really stands out in my memory. It started with a minor infection. My parents went to the doctor. The doctor tried some different prescriptions, but it didn't work and it got worse. And so he transferred us to a specialist. That specialist transferred us to the hospital. And then that hospital, at a complete loss, transferred us to the local city children's hospital. And while I was there, the doctors were amazing. They were attentive, they were caring, but they were also concerned about this infection that they could not stop. So they chose to do some aggressive treatments, scheduled medication very regularly, and had a very strict routine that they needed me to adhere to while in the hospital. Problem is that on the outside, everything looked like it was being done to be treated, but on the inside, the infection got worse. I I had a staph infection, and no matter what they did, they could not stop this infection. For a time, they grew frustrated. My parents grew nervous and scared, and any suggestions my parents had were ignored because the doctors knew what they were doing. One of the things that was being ignored was the lancing and draining of my blisters. One in particular that was getting worse and worse. At home, they would be lanced and drained and then bandaged to make sure that infection wasn't something that could easily happen to those blisters. But the doctors, unsure of how to treat this skin disorder, said, no, we're not going to treat that. We're just going to keep on giving him medicine. So anytime my mom suggested, they shut her down. But the infection continued. I wasn't getting better. In fact, I was getting worse. My health was declining more and more, and the doctors, they just were at a loss. But here's the part that matters. The doctors were treating everything around the wound, but they were nervous and scared and unsure what to do about the wound itself. And at a certain point, my mother, being frustrated, being heartbroken, and being fearful that she was going to lose her firstborn, broke the doctor's rules. That major blister that was bothering me, that looked like it was infected, that they wouldn't let her lance and drain, she did it behind the doctor's back. She didn't do what they wanted her to do, and because of that, well, she heard about it. They kept on trying to manage the symptoms, and she went after the wound itself. She realized that the problem wasn't just complexity. A lot of the problem was avoidance. Surprising thing was, as upset as they were, within a day or two, my health started to rise. I started to get a bit better. The doctors were shocked. They were excited. And then even more surprised when within a week I was discharged with a clean bill of health. See, in the end, the healing didn't come from just medication and just some treatment. The healing came from addressing something that everyone else was afraid to deal with. Years later, looking over ministry, I realized the same type of issues can occur. This hospital room was a picture of a lot of our churches. See, churches are often great at dealing with the symptoms. We know how to treat them. We know how to manage behavior, how to get everyone in line, how to make sure everything talks and sounds good. We know how to deal with the optics, and so we manage them very good, making sure the facades look great, making sure we are well dressed, and that everything runs with a level of perfection. We are great at managing attendance. And most importantly, we're great at managing perceptions within the church. We could be having everything fall apart around us, but as I've heard a lot of churches say, behind the closed doors, we deal with the issues. In front of everyone, we put on an act. We're great at managing all those things, but often we're deeply uncomfortable as leaders to address wounds. Because wounds are messy. Wounds cause all sorts of issues. Wounds don't fit any type of job description. And most importantly, wounds don't really fit into office hours. So instead of dealing with the wounds, we end up spiritualizing them. We end up using phrases like, well, I'm fine. I'm fine. How many of you guys have said, I'm fine? Even though everything within you is falling apart, your family is just collapsing, the different wounds, maybe it's a physical pain, maybe it's an emotional pain that you've gone through, it's just utterly destroying you and shattering you from the inside, and yet someone says, how are you doing? And you're like, I'm fine. Maybe we use excuses like, well, it's just the busy season, and once the busy season's over, then I'll feel better. Then I'll deal with the feelings that I'm going through. And what you fail to mention or acknowledge is the fact that that busy season has been happening for years and years and years, and you're never out of the busy season. A lot of times we make excuses and say, well, this is just part of leadership. I made that excuse for many years to deal with the wounds that I had deep within. It's just part of being a leader, and I just got to suck it up and push through. Or maybe we start lying to ourselves and say, well, it's not an issue because God is still using me. And that's a scary lie to tell ourselves, and scarier when we start believing it in the midst of bleeding out because of these wounds that we have suffered, that we've left go unaddressed. And the truth of the matter is that God can and does still use us while we're wounded. But the biggest thing is that God doesn't want you to stay wounded. God's goal is not for us to stay bleeding out and hurting constantly. While he can use us, that's not where he wants to leave us. In fact, in Jeremiah 6:14, it says this: "They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious." This verse wasn't written to outsiders. This verse is actually written to leaders. And it still applies to us nowadays because it's dealing with something that I think a lot of us fail to deal with. It's that we let these wounds continue to grow and fester and never actually deal with them because we feel like if I just keep it to myself, then it'll stay private and I can just deal with it on my own. But what we fail to realize is it never just stays private. It eventually, no matter how good we are with it, no matter how much we box it up or try to keep it contained, it eventually leaks out. It just doesn't leak out in the ways that we always expect it to, especially as a leader. It'll leak out in the way that we try to control things and the way that we try to manage and keep things going the way that we want to. For some people, it leaks out in the way that they seek after people pleasing. They try to make sure that everyone is happy and everyone has a smile on their face and everything is a good fake facade. It leaks out into anger. It leaks out into withdrawal. It leaks out into overworking ourselves. It also starts leaking out into the way that we deal with our staff, how we treat our volunteers, how we address and minister to our congregation, our students, our kids. And if we're not careful, that leak from that pain that we experience, that pain, that hurt, that wound will eventually become part of our very church culture. See, health isn't containing and pretending like the pain isn't there, but it's also not living in a way that pain becomes your entire platform. The way that you do things, everything within your ministry is tied up around your pain, not as a testimony of what God has done, but almost as a victim mentality. Now, see, instead, health, when it comes to the pains and the wounds that we go through within our life, and as a leader, health comes from naming and addressing the hurt and then inviting God to be a part of that healing process. If we look at Psalms in 147:3, it says, "He heals the brokenhearted. He binds up their wounds." Do you ever read a verse and as you're reading it, it just hits you? You feel like it's speaking directly to you. Maybe you sense that peace as you read those verses, or it's not like you're just reading from a story, but you're reading something that goes deep within your heart. When I read that, there is a sense of peace and relief, but also notice the order of things. The brokenness is acknowledged. And after the brokenness is acknowledged and admitted to, then the healing process can start to happen. I mean, if you look at how Jesus even modeled this within leadership, or even in the fact that he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, if we look at that story, we see the Samaritan comes along, and what does he do? Does he just pick up the person that's been beat up and say, "Hey, go, I helped you up, there you go"? No, he deals with the wounds. He starts the healing process. And then from there, does he kick him along and say, "No, go on your own"? No, he brings them to a place of healing and restoration where this person can rest. They can take time. He pays for the man's stay so that it becomes rejuvenated and whole. He didn't rush this wounded man into productivity. Instead, he allowed the healing, sometimes being a slow one, to start going into effect and to start seeing this man restored. He treated the wound first, and then, and only then, did the movement start to happen. See, when it comes to leadership, especially in the way that we lead our churches, our ministries, our congregations, a healthy leader is one that allows trusted people to see a bit beneath the surface. And notice I say trusted people. You don't want to just let everyone in, but there are many of us leaders and pastors that we don't let anyone in. Trust is a very hard thing for us. It's why later on in this series, we're going to be talking about how we grow in that trust and how we let others in, because we're not meant to go at this through the lone wolf mentality. If we really want to be healthy, it means allowing some people that we trust to see the real us, to know maybe some of those wounds and some of those vulnerabilities that we have. I've heard it referred to as having those black holes of people within our life that we know that we can share stuff to, and it's never going to go anywhere else besides that mentor and that friendship area. Health with leadership also looks like allowing God to work on the why, not just the what. Kind of like in that hospital where the doctors got to a point where they were just treating the symptoms and they didn't work on the wound itself. There are many of us that we allow God to work on the symptoms, but we don't really let God work on the issue. We flip out and we're angry and we're like, God, help me with my anger, but we never address why we're angry. We're scared to allow that level of vulnerability happen. And so even with God, we only let him go surface level within our life. A healthy leader is one that doesn't just look at the what, but they allow God to work on the why. And as we shared within the pain episode in the first season, a healthy leader is one that leads from scars and not wounds. See, when you have a scar, it's something that is healed. Yes, there's the markings. Yes, you have that testimony and that story of what God did, but it's a healed wound. There are many of us that we're not leading from those healings, but instead we're leading from that wound. And so because of that, we're bleeding out on everyone that we minister to. And as a leader, we replicate a lot of who we are and what we are. And so not only are we bleeding out on people because these wounds are still active and not healed and not addressed, but we start replicating those wounds in those that we're ministering to, those that we're discipling, those that we're raising up. Maybe as I'm sharing these things, there's already a level of, man, he's talking about me. That's rising up within you. Maybe as I'm reading these things and talking about these things to you, you're like, I realize that I've been bleeding out. Maybe some of you have been pushing along for a decade or two, and you know that wound's there, and it almost breaks you up inside, but you're scared for that level of trust. You're scared to take that next step. But you're like, I know I need to, not only for my health, but my ministry's health. If that's you, let's walk through some of these action steps that we can start taking today to make sure that not only are we leading in the healthiest way possible, but we ourselves are growing and healing in the midst of leading from the pain. The first thing that we can do is we can start to identify the symptom that we manage the most. You've heard of the cause and the effect. What is the effect that you see that raises up within you? The thing that comes to the forefront constantly. Are you dealing with anger? Is that the symptom? Identify it. Identify those symptoms that rise up within you. If you find yourself overwhelmed and you just start people pleasing and you're like, I know I shouldn't be saying yes to this. I know I shouldn't be making this person happy. Instead, I should be addressing some of these things. Well, then that is the symptom. Identify it. And then once you identify it, then you start diving a little bit below the surface. You want to start naming the pain that's beneath that symptom. Are you acting out in anger? Well, what's the cause for that anger? If the effect is the anger, what's the cause, the underlying cause for that anger? If you jump to people pleasing when you know you shouldn't and you should be taking a stand and you should be leading, well, what's the cause of that people pleasing? Is there a wound that lies a lot more beneath the surface? Once you identify it, then you can start naming that cause. Maybe a big question to ask yourself is, what am I afraid to feel? Meaning, if this is the effect, what is this effect covering over? What am I afraid to experience or identify within me? Name it. Sometimes that means inviting an outside perspective. There's so many times that we're so overwhelmed with what we're dealing with that we don't identify the issues. Let's put it this way. If you're a guy, there's always that joke of you go to the fridge to get something that your spouse or someone else has asked for, and you open it up and you look all over and you don't see it, and then they step into the fridge and with fear and realization, they find it right away. I mean, you were looking for it and you could not see it. I've been there so many times. And yet it was right there. Sometimes we are in the midst of everything and we're dealing with this pain and we don't even realize it. We have these wounds and we don't even realize it. Or when we try to name it, sometimes we can't because it's like staring at the fridge. And even though that ketchup is right there, we fail to see it. And that's why an outside perspective sometimes is needed. Again, someone that you trust to look at your life and be like, I see you're angry, but I know where that anger is coming from. Because if you look at it, it started at this. Here's the root to it. Sometimes, though, it means inviting that outside perspective to look at our life, to look at what we're experiencing, to look at the effect, to figure out that underlying cause. But can I tell you, one of the big things that we need to do is we need to stop spiritualizing what God wants to heal. Sometimes we make that, well, this is just my cross to bear. This is just the thing that I got to push through. Well, Paul had his thorn in the flesh. This is my thorn in the flesh. And you almost, again, you're back to that victim mentality. You're like, this is just what I got to push through. And meanwhile, that's not what God is saying. In some of these cases, God is like, no, I want you to heal. Because you're not doing what I've called you to do because you're struggling with this wound. I want you to heal, but you keep on spiritualizing that wound. And for some of you, the big action step that you need to do, and this is the harder one, is that you need to refuse to lead from the wound. There are many of us that have such deep wounds. And more than anything, we feel like we're helping God. We're being a good leader by continuing to lead as we bleed out. But as I said, you replicate a lot of what you are as a leader. And we don't realize that we're not helping others, but we're adding to their wounds as well. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is to take a step, a pause away, to allow yourself to let that healing happen so that you don't cause wounds in others. There are many of us that our story has that wound, has that trauma. And for some of us, it's a leader that caused that trauma within us. I know it's scary and it's a humbling thing to do, but sometimes we need to put a pause on what we're doing so that we don't become that leader in someone else's story that caused a wound within them. If, as we're talking about this, you start to feel those wounds rise up within you, if maybe it hits deep and you're like, there's a healing that needs to take place. Maybe it's more than a healing. Maybe you realize I've been leading in the midst of this pain and God wants me healed and whole before I continue leading others. Can I tell you, no matter what you've experienced, I say this on a constant basis, and yet it still rings true. If this episode, if this topic hits deep, it does not mean that you're weak. It also doesn't mean that you're broken beyond repair and that God's like, I just don't know what to do. You are never too broken for God to heal. On top of that, it doesn't disqualify you from ministry. It doesn't disqualify you from life. God's not like, I'm done with you. I can't believe this. But can I tell you, more than anything, it does mean that you need to be responsible. You need to be responsible to yourself. In the midst of this, you need to be responsible to your family. And then as a shepherd and a leader, we need to be responsible to the congregation that we are leading. Because we can be sitting there and all that pain and all that wound, expecting God to heal it when we never address it and never fully give it over to Him. God loves you and He cares about you. But God will never heal something that we are choosing to hide from Him. While He wants to heal us, while He wants to make us whole, while He wants to mend those things and work on our heart, if we choose to hide it and keep it from Him, we'll never find healing. Instead, He invites us to be whole, but it's up to us to be able to be honest, to be vulnerable, to give these things to Him, to identify those things, to allow Him to start that work, to start that process, and to find ourselves healed and whole, no matter how long that process takes. But when we allow Him to, yes, it may be slow. Yes, it may be deep. And even in the healing process, it may be painful. But as we do that and as we allow Him to go through that, our leadership begins to change. Sure, our churches, our leadership style, our platform may not be louder. It may not be flashier. But if we allow him to, then our platforms, our ministries, and even ourselves as leaders and Christians start to become more healthier and reproduce healthier disciples. If you've gone through a pain, a trauma, and maybe you have a testimony of what God has done through it, or maybe you just need someone to walk alongside of you to keep you in prayer, I would love to hear your story. Do me a favor and leave us a comment, a message on our website so that we can start that interaction. We can start that connection. I love to see what God is doing, and most importantly, I also love to see what God is in the process of starting. But please hear me when I say, you're not meant to walk this alone. In closing today, I want you to think deeply about someone, maybe a person in your life, maybe another leader, a fellow pastor, or someone that you know that is going through a level of pain. Or maybe they've seen that pain redeemed. Share this episode with them. Have them share their story, their testimony. Encourage them in some way so that they know not only are they not alone, but their story, their pain, their hurt that God healed, it mattered. If this episode was helpful to you, I'd love, again, for you to share it, but also to leave a comment or a review. That way, this gets out to more and more pastors and leaders that need it. Now, this Friday, we're going to be having an awesome conversation with a fellow pastor that I've known for many, many years. But he has a story of hurt and of trauma, but it doesn't end there. Instead, he has a story that he shares about the redemptive power of Christ and what he can do with the hurt that we've experienced. He experienced the pain like no other, but more importantly, he also experienced God's redemptive power, and he's going to share a bit about that and some wisdom with us this Friday. Sorry, not Wednesday. This is Wednesday. I look forward to seeing you guys again and having you guys hear and share in his story. Until then, let's work together to build healthier ministries, starting with maybe some of the wounds in our life that we've let go unaddressed, to allow ourselves to heal so that our ministries can become healthier as we work to go beyond the numbers. Thanks.